growth is a very important characteristic feature of living organisms. And also we know that very important characteristic feature that is called differentiation. Growth is accompanied by metabolic process that occurs at the expense of energy. The lateral meristem, vascular cambium and core cambium appears later, responsible for increasing in the girth. And the cell walls, what will be the nature of the cell wall? The cell walls are primary in nature. Hello everyone, welcome back to session 1 of chapter 15 called Plant Growth and Development. Myself, B. Shobharani from the Department of Biology, Vidhyaashram Pre-University College, the Temple of Excellence. The name of the chapter itself will tell, Plant Growth and Development. As we all know that growth is a very important, fundamental and conspicuous characteristic feature of living organisms. How do we define the word called growth then? Even in animals also, growth is a very important characteristic feature of living organisms. As we know, plants also grow and also animals also grow. So plant growth and development are the very important features of the living organisms, may it be the plant or an animal. So now let us understand what is plant growth. How do we define the word called growth? Growth can be defined as a permanent, irreversible increase in size of an organ or its parts or even of an individual cell. So how do we define the word called growth then? An irreversible, like if we grow tall, can we become small? No, it is not possible. So in a similar way, and it is an irreversible, permanent increase in size of an organ, may it be organ or its parts or even of an individual cell. Growth is accompanied by metabolic process that occurs at the expense of energy. So, growth is accompanied by metabolic process. I think all of us know there are a series of metabolic processes happening inside the plant body which was very much responsible for growth at the expense of energy. As we all know, energy is the prime requirement to carry on the various physiological processes. So at the expense of energy, various metabolic processes. Here you can see in this beautiful picture the growth of a plant. But this is a small growing plant. We can call it as a sapling. But will it be of the same size? If all the parameters or all the essentials are given to the plant, then it will grow tall. So growth will take place. So how do we define the word called growth? Growth is a very important, fundamental and conspicuous characteristic feature of living organisms, may it be a plant or an animal. In this particular session, we are talking about the growth in plants or plant growth. And how do we define the word called growth then? Growth is an irreversible, permanent increase in size of an organ or its parts or even of an individual cell. Growth is accompanied by metabolic process that occurs at the expense of energy. All of us know we need energy to do work. So also growth is also a very important physiological process which needs energy, and even as you know, it is accompanied by many metabolic processes that require energy to carry on its processes. Growth can be measured. I think all of us know when we sow a seed, it grows into a small seedling, then it will start growing. So how do we measure the growth of a plant? There are many parameters to measure the growth of a plant. So growth can be measured by the variety of parameters like dry weight, fresh weight, length. Very important. No? When the plant is growing tall, then we say growth has taken place. may it be even in animals, right? So when it is growing, so we say length plays a greater, then even the area. So as it grows, it occupies more area. It will not be the same area. Then volume, even the volume also increases. Then even the cell number. So growth can be measured by the variety of parameters like the dry weight, the fresh weight, the length, the area, the volume and the cell number. Hope you all have understood what is plant growth. As I said, it is a very, very important, fundamental and conspicuous characteristic feature of plants. How do we define the word called growth in plants? It is an irreversible, permanent increase in size of an organ or its parts or even of an individual cell. Growth is accompanied by metabolic process that occurs at the expense of energy. Growth can be measured by the variety of parameters like the dry weight, fresh weight, length, area, volume and cell number. Now, we all know that growth is definite in case of animals, whereas in case of plants, it is indeterminate. And why the plants grow continuously? Because of a presence of a very important tissue called the meristematic tissue. That is, so this meristematic tissue has the capacity to divide and redivide and increase in the number of cells. As we know, increase in number of cells is nothing but called growth, right? So as we all know, particularly when we talk about plants and animals are multicellular organisms. How have they become cellular because of the division of the cells. More the division, more will be the number of cells. And also we know that very important characteristic feature that is called differentiation. That is the cells group into tissues, tissues into organs and organs into organ system. We all know that the advantage of being a multicellular is the multicellular organisms, may it be a plant or an animal, have different organs, organ system, and different organ system make an organism, and the organism is able to carry on all the activities of the body so very meticulously. So growth is a very, very important prime factor. And as we know, plant growth is indeterminate. What do you mean by indeterminate? You can also use the word called indefinite. Whereas growth in animals is definite. Growth in animals is definite. Do human beings continuously grow? No. Growth is for a particular period. After that, growth is stopped, but all the other activities will go on. But in case of plants, like very common thing what we come across in plants is trimming. Pruning. So when we prune the plants, cut off all the leaves, after some days we find fresh leaves being grown or even the plant growing tall. How is this possible? It is because of this meristematic tissue. As you have already studied in anatomy of flowering plants, meristematic cells are the cells which have the capacity to divide and redivide at a faster rate. So they have active rate of mitotic cell division which is responsible for growth. So because of the presence of this meristematic tissue, the plants are able to continue their growth forever. So that is very important feature of plant growth. Plant growth is generally indeterminate in case of plant. That is, plants retain the capacity of unlimited growth throughout their life. So whereas in case of animals, it is limited growth. For a particular, for example, 20 years. So man will grow only up to 20 years. Human beings grow only up to 20 years. After that, they don't grow. But the other activities will grow. Does it mean that everything will stop? No, only growth will stop. The growth process is stopped, but all the other activities will go on in a regular manner. So that is the plant, the growth in animals is definite or determinate, whereas the plant growth is indefinite or indeterminate, and it is because of the presence of the meristematic cell. So the meristematic cells have the capacity to regain back their dividing capacity, and that is the reason why the cells regrow, and also they are responsible for regrowth. And this ability is due to the presence of meristems at certain locations in their plant body. As we already studied in anatomy of flowering plants, usually meristematic tissue or meristematic cells or meristems in short form are found in the root tip and the shoot tip. Why root tip and the shoot tip? Here you can see the root tip and the shoot tip. Root tip, this is a shoot tip. Here you can call it as determinate. This is called indeterminate. It means the growth will stop. So here it is, no, it does not stop. So shoot tip and the root tip will have the meristematic tissues. So the meristematic tissue or the meristematic cells are found in the root tip and the shoot tip. Why? These are the growing regions. These are the growing regions of the plant body. They are the growing regions of the plant body and hence they are responsible for growth. So the cells of such meristematic have capacity to divide and self-perpetuate. Again means, again to redivide. Divide and redivide. Divide and redivide. So plant growth is generally indeterminate. That is, it grows continuously. Whereas growth is determinate or definite in case of animals. So what is that which is responsible for the plants to retain their capacity to grow further again? It is because of the meristematic tissue. Meristematic tissue are a group of cells which has the capacity to divide and redivide at a faster rate, or they have the ability to carry on active rate of mitotic cell division, thereby increasing in the number of cells and helping in growth. Usually they are found in the root tip and the shoot tip. Root tip and shoot tip are the growing regions of the plant body, and that is how they are able to regrow. So plants retain the capacity of unlimited growth throughout their life. This ability is due to the presence of meristems at certain locations in their body. The cells of such meristems have capacity to divide and self-perpetuate. Now, the product eventually loses the capacity to derive and differentiate and differentiated. So, I think we all of us know that. For example, when you prune the plants or cut the plants, so everything will stop growing. But after some time, again, you can see the regrowth happening in such plants. So, you find fresh leaves, fresh stem, shoot, everything being formed, right? And as we all know that the apical meristems responsible for primary growth of the plants and principally contribute to the elongation of the plants along their axis. Hope you have already studied about the meristematic tissues. The meristems are of three types. That is apical meristems, intercalary meristems and the lateral meristems. So these are the three types. So apical meristems are usually found in the root tip and the shoot tip. They are found in the root tip and the shoot tip. Intercalary, that is in between the nodes. And lateral sides. So these meristems, so apical meristems is usually found in the root tip and the shoot tip, which is responsible for vertical growth, length. So when we say growth, growth is measured by means of girth, thickness as well as length, vertical growth and horizontal growth. So the apical meristem responsible for primary growth of plants. As we know, the first growth of plants is made possible by the apical meristems and principally contribute to the elongation of the plants along their axis. So here, if you say growth, this is the axis, right? So the lateral meristems. The lateral meristem, vascular cambium and cork cambium appears later, responsible for increasing in the girth. Girth means what? Thickness. Thickness of stem. We all know stem, wood. When do we call it as wood? When it is thick, right? So the lateral meristem, vascular cambium, as I have already studied in anatomy of flowering plants, the lateral meristem, vascular cambium and cork cambium appear later, responsible for the increase in the girth. So the product eventually loses the capacity to derive and differentiate. The apical meristems are responsible for primary growth of the plant and principally contribute to the elongation of the plants along their axis. So the lateral meristem, vascular cambium and cork cambium appear later, responsible for increasing in the girth or thickness of the stem. Now, moving on to the phases of growth. So, growth has three very important phases. One is called the meristematic phase, the elongation phase, and the maturation phase. So, what are phases means what? What do you mean by phases? The stages. Three very important stages of growth. So, the period of growth is generally divided into three phases. What are they? Meristematic phase. So here meristematic phase can also be called as the formative phase. Can also be called as what? Formative phase. Then elongation phase and the maturation phase. So here you can see the first phase is the formative phase, or you can also call it as the meristematic phase. So what do you find here? You find the meristems. Then this particular part is called the elongation phase. So this part is called maturation phase. So this part is called the formative phase. So what are the three? So here you can see how a small, I think as soon as we sow a seed, it sprouts. And that sprouting will, you can see the seed, one part of the plant seed will develop into root system and one part of the seed develop into shoot system. What is that which develops into shoot system? The radical. What is that which develops into root system? That is the radical of a seed. What is that which develops into shoot system? That is the plumule of a seed. So here we can see even in root or in stem the three very important phases. So here you can see in the root formative phase, elongation phase and maturation phase. So what are the three very important phases of growth? One is called the meristematic phase, elongation phase as well as the maturation phase. Now, as we all know, root apex. Apex means tip. Shoot apex means tip. Represents the meristematic phase of growth. So here the root apex and the root tip and the shoot tip. Shoot tip and this is the root tip. The root tip and the shoot tip represent what? The formative phase or the meristematic. Why meristematic phase we use the word? Because the meristems are found in that particular phase. And what is a very important characteristic feature of meristematic cells? You can use the word called meristem in short forms. Divide and redivide. Cells divide and redivide and increase in number of cells So this particular phase is called as the meristem. So it is also called as formative phase. The cells divide and redivide, and as the cells divide and redivide, you can see the growth happening. So here you can see the growth. So then the cells will get elongated. So the region will not be in the same. So it will start elongating. So this particular phase is called as elongation phase. And here the cells will become differentiated. What do you mean by cells becoming differentiated? They have a particular function to perform. That is, the cells group into tissues and tissues into organs. So they have a specific function to perform. The cell walls are primary in nature, thin and cellulosic with abundant plasmodesmatal connection. So particularly we know the initial phase of growth, we find that the cell wall, as you know, the characteristic feature of the plant cell is what? They have a very thin cell wall made up of cellulose. So the cell walls are primary in nature. As it grows, it becomes secondary. But when it is in the growing region, as you know, it will be light green in color. So here you can see light green in color. Whereas as it grows, it becomes dark green in color. Dark green in color. So the cell walls are primary in nature, thin and cellulosic with abundant plasmodesmatal. What are plasmodesmatal? They are called as cytoplasmic connections. They are called as cytoplasmic connection. What do you mean by cytoplasmic? One cell will communicate with the adjacent cell through channels called cytoplasmic connections or channels. So the cell walls are primary in nature, thin and cellulosic with abundant plasmodesmatal connections. So what are the phases of growth? The period of growth is generally divided into 3 phases. What are they? Formative phase or meristematic phase, elongation phase and the maturation phase. So usually the root apex and the shoot apex will have the meristematic phase of growth, and the cell walls, what will be the nature of the cell wall? The cell walls are primary in nature. Primary in nature means they will be thin, not thick, and as you know, cellulose is the primary cell wall material. Later on, as it grows, it is deposited with hemicellulose, pectin and lignin. With abundant plasmodesmatal connections means cytoplasmic connections. Then the cell walls, as we already said, the cells proximal to that region are the phase of elongation. So here, once the formative phase is, once the cells divide and increase in number so what will happen? So this is called as elongation. The cells proximal to the region are the phase of elongation. So they will start expanding. They will start, the region will start growing. Means it will not be in the same region. So once it will start multiplying, this will not be. So it will start expanding. So that is called elongation region. And increased vacuolation, cell enlargement and new cell wall deposition are the characteristic of the cell wall. So what will here in meristematic phase, as we know, the cell walls are primary in nature, thin, cellulosic and have plasmodesmatal connection. But as they grow and they reach the elongation phase, then increased vacuolation. So actually the vacuoles will be very less or maybe absent in case of meristematic phase. But here we can see what are vacuoles. Vacuoles are the very important characteristic feature of a plant cell which store the unwanted substances or their gastric substance. So increased vacuolation, cell enlargement. So here you can see the cell enlargement and new cell wall deposition. As I said, the primary cell wall material will be cellulose, but there is an additional deposition of pectin, right? So pectin will take hemicellulose, right? So that is a character feature. Further away from the zone of elongation is the phase of maturation. So afterwards it will reach to maturation phase. First is formative phase or meristematic phase, then comes the elongation phase, then comes the maturation phase. What is this maturation phase? Right, so the cells of this zone attain their maximal size in terms of wall thickening and protoplasmic modification. So that is the reason why they are called as what? Matured cells. So this particular region called maturation phase, the cells of this zone, that is the maturation zone, you can also use the word called zone also, meristematic zone, elongation zone and the maturation zone. The cells of this zone attain their maximal size in terms of wall thickenings and protoplasmic modifications. So the cells proximal to the region of formative or the meristematic region is called the phase of elongation. So increased vacuolation, cell enlargement and new cell wall deposition are the characteristic feature of the cell wall. But as we know, this is the meristematic phase. So the cell walls are primary in nature, thin and cellulosic with abundant plasmodesmatal connection. So this is elongation phase. And this is the maturation phase. Maturation phase. So the cell walls are primary in nature, thin and cellulosic with abundant plasmodesmatal connections. And the cells proximal to that region is called phase of elongation. What is characterized by elongation phase? The increased vacuolation. So there is formation of vacuoles, cell enlargement and new cell deposition, that is cellulose with hemicellulose, are the characteristic feature of the cell phase. Further away from the zone of elongation is the phase of maturation. So what is the characteristic feature of phase of maturation? The cells of this zone attain their maximal size in terms of wall thickening and protoplasmic modifications. Hope you have understood the first very important session of this chapter called Plant Growth and Development. Such a very, very important characteristic feature of plants, we can say. Growth as well as development. If just only growth will not take place, what is development? So once the cells multiply and increase in number, they get differentiated. That, as we know, plant has plant parts like the root, the stem, the leaf. So the process of formation of this is called differentiation. Cells group into tissues, tissues into organs, and organs into organ system, and organ system make an organism. So I'll be back in the coming session with some more interesting concepts of this chapter called plant growth and development. Till then, goodbye and thank you.